Hey everyone, thanks for joining. This is Pete Morgan with Phylum, and today I'm going to interview Ross Bryant, our head of security research, on the topic of our quarterly research report. So this is something that Phylum does every quarter where we go through all of the interesting stuff that Phylum sees from blocking and identifying these supply chain attacks in the open source ecosystems. And Ross here is going to tell us about what he found. So Ross, please introduce yourself.
Well, thanks, Pete. I'm Ross. I'm the head of security research here at Phylum, and I lead the research team to expand our automated detection of supply chain attacks in open source ecosystems.
Awesome. So the research report that we're going to show here in just a second, popping this up, there's a lot of numbers on this figure. Tell us about what's interesting here.
Well, the biggest one is just the staggering amount of spam that we saw in NPM and PyPI. It seemed like sometime in February, the floodgates just opened and hundreds of thousands of packages being published of various kinds to do various things. It wasn't just a uniform single point of attack, but it was overwhelming, the amount of stuff we saw. Another highlight of the quarter was the typo squatting campaign. We'll have an example of that later, but essentially this attacker register was about 6 for 7 for every 6 successes out of every 7 attempts to lay a little minefield around all of these very popular packages on PyPI like matplotlib and scikit-learn and various cryptocurrency libraries.
Interesting. So does that seem like they're targeting certain areas? It sounds like data sciencey to me.
In the beginning, they were targeting specifically cryptocurrency libraries, but as the attack went on, it seemed like they just like, well, that looks like a popular package, and clearly it was an automated thing because from the time they started registering these typo squats to the end was usually on the order of a minute and a half. So they clearly had some mechanism where they just hit the button and the packages start flying in. And like I said, they were pretty efficient and pretty successful.
Interesting. What are some of your favorites from this quarter? Like, you get to see all this data, and I definitely get to see some of the end results of it, but kind of jealous of getting the hands dirty. What are some of your favorites on that you looked at this quarter?
Yeah, so the really interesting one for me this quarter was the Unicode support in the Python interpreter. I was actually able to submit and was selected to give a lightning talk about this at PyCon. So that video maybe will come out sometime soon. But basically, when you look at the code, it looks as if the code is written in a different font, like italic or bold in certain areas. And it just doesn't make sense that would actually run. And so I did some digging down into the details of the Python interpreter. And it turns out that for functionality, the Python interpreter actually normalizes those characters, if they can, down to ASCII. So if you have a bold-faced italic W, it looks like a bold italic W when you look at it, and the Lexer sees it as a bold italic W. But then when it gets to the parser says, let's normalize that down to just normal ASCII W. And they did this all over their code. And so it's almost as if their obfuscation was hiding in plain sight, right?
This is the Windows wide character support thing all over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. Exactly. I mean, and it was kind of a head scratcher. And I was certain that this was another example of code that just simply wouldn't run. Like, there's no way this is going to work, because you can just say, does this string equal this string? No. In any object, like self is spelled so many different ways, and yet they all normalize back down to just self. So it's completely transparent to the interpreter, and it's like the best of both worlds. Anything that's looking for certain strings in static source code analysis, it's going to miss all this stuff. But the obfuscator, like the person who obfuscated it, can still read what they're doing. So it was an interesting little trick, and it wasn't one that I was expecting.
Very cool.
And that just, like, obfuscation schemes, there's a lot of old ones that people still use in Python and NPM specifically, but we are seeing some new variants, and those are always interesting, especially in an interpreted language where the code has to run. So ultimately, you're only slowing down analysis. You're not going to actually stop people from ultimately deciding what's underneath there and figuring it out.
Right, right. Very cool. Um, as far as some of the higher level aspects of these attacks, like what really stood out to you this quarter? Was there anything unique in particular?
Yeah, automation. Like I said, the spam attacks, the typo squatting attacks. Like clearly, these actors are learning the power of simple scripting, where you
Yeah,
just simply, instead of making a bespoke one-off cool package, some of these actors are just loud and proud and just scattershoot all these packages all over the ecosystems. And sometimes they were able to do it with, I think there was one account in particular, an NPM, one of these spammers, I think they were accounted for something like 80,000 packages over a very small number of days. Other spammers are a little wiser to it. They'll register a package and then, or they'll register a username and then they'll put out 40 packages and then never use that again. They'll burn that one and then 24 packages for this one. And so as ecosystem maintainers, as we as security professionals get better at detecting them, they're just going to keep evolving their tactics. And I think automation is here to stay.
yeah, it
As
makes
if it
sense.
never
Like
was gone.
if there really isn't consequences to, if you think about it, if it's that easy to create a new account on one of these package registries, and you can just immediately start, releasing software on it. We're kind of making it pretty easy on the like. There's no KYC or know your customer in this
Right.
kind of world, right? Because open source is a little bit more privacy centric and anonymous. So it's unfortunately a little bit of a detractor here, it seems.
It is. And I mean, it really does highlight something that I've been thinking about for a while. Um, some of these things that are security concerns, they do have technical solutions, but fundamentally, what is an open source software community, I think, is really what these attacks are really exploiting. I think there's good reason for these accounts to be cheap and easy to register, because the whole point of the open source community of the relatively modern era is like anybody can contribute. And in fact, probably most of the big contributors started to learn to program just under that paradigm. And if you make the bar too high, you're not really open anymore. It's not really
Yeah,
free and open in the wider senses. And so it's like, what are the consequences we're willing to live with in a society or in a community, I guess, where this stuff is easy to get? And there's going to be vigorous debate around, okay, well, how high should we make that bar to be this tall to ride this ride? And I've seen it in Hacker News comments when, based on PyPI's action this past weekend of
right.
shutting down new account. That was because they were under a couple of different attacks. One was a combo squatting attack where you jam two popular words together, two words that have a brand to them, like Python and OpenSSL. When you do OpenSSL-Python, and just seeing a rash of those attacks, they just shut it down for 30 hours and said, okay, we need a break here. We need to hit the pause button. But the community, I think, got into a vigorous debate on Hacker News, at least the thread I saw, about, wait a minute, should we make it hard for people? Because clearly that's one way to stem this, flood of attacks, but not everybody's agreed on that. And that's not going to be an easy problem to solve quickly.
Yeah, it's one of those things that a thing I go back to is open communities like the open source ecosystems are great because it really enables everyone to contribute, and you get
right.
Someone you never expect contributing some brilliant ideas. There's brilliant people all over the world, but if anyone can contribute, it means anyone can contribute, including the bad guys, and that's like it's just like the perfect example of a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah. Another thread that I saw got me thinking about reflecting on this spam. Maybe in our culture, like we would look at that type of behaviors like that's antisocial behavior. You're polluting the ecosystem with all your packages. And yet in another culture, if I can write a script and make a few bucks on the side where maybe, money is a little harder to come by, or it's, like, why wouldn't I try to do that? Or why, and so these cultural clashes, I think, are also going to play out somewhat too, where if you really are going to have a wide open global ecosystem, then these cultural clashes are going to happen.
That's a really good point. There's a lot of places around the world where there isn't a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, right?
Right.
It's not illegal formally to do
Right.
things that we think of as overtly illegal here.
That's right.
And yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Um, we hear a lot about vulns in open source.
Yeah.
From the data you see, and the perspective again from the work that went into this research report, like how do you view that?
So I was at OpenSSF earlier this month, and vulnerabilities was like a huge topic. And after listening to some of the players' different voices, I kept thinking about the attacks that we're actually seeing, and I don't doubt there's packages out there that are exploiting some CVE. We see those all the time, but that's not really the majority of things that we see. What we see are almost like bespoke 0 days. You pip installed something, and in the setup.py was a snippet of malicious code. Maybe not the malware itself, but a snippet of malicious code that had you curl some link shortened URL that is completely opaque. You don't know what resource is out there, but you got it. You wrote it to a binary file, and then you exec that file in the following line, and that just happened just because you typed pip install. So that doesn't mean that's above and beyond the fact that vulnerabilities take a long time to curate and to vet and to finally get published. And when they get published, how do you know to go out and find? Like, there's that's a real lagging indicator. Whereas these attacks that we're seeing, I think, are closer to leading indicators. Like they're a better canary of what people are actually doing. And it doesn't seem like right now attacking a known vulnerability is what's in vogue. What's in vogue is I just wrote some code and I got you to click on that. It's a variation of I got you to click on a link in an email. I was able to get you to go somewhere, pull down a resource of my choosing, which may or not be there 5 minutes later at the same location.
Right.
And then I gave it to you and you executed it, and good luck.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought about that correlation to something like phishing before, but it makes perfect sense, right? You're trying to convince a user to do something that harms them without them knowing it, right? And just the open source supply chain can be very difficult to figure out that's happening because it takes so much work to go dig into all this stuff.
That's right.
At time, right? While you were talking about that, like the Matplotlib package, I went and found, like, you guys wrote an article about it. You and the team wrote an article about this, right? Yeah. I pulled up a spot of that. Maybe you could show us a little more, kind of talk through some of the cool parts of this.
So this was that typo squatting campaign I was telling you about, where the guy was, went like 6 for 7. Basically, take a package name like Matplotlib, and then generate a list of every insertion or deletion or transposition of 2 characters. So like the very innocent typos that we all make, you get typing too fast and you invert 2 characters. So for example, if you typed pip install matplotlib, which I've typed matplotlib, I can't tell you how many times, or polt when I'm trying to use matplotlib, because I'm a terrible typist, you got this. And what you see there, this little chart, is a set of characters that all of the function names were in the setup.py file. You got this massive blob of stuff. And when you start picking it, right, yeah, that's it. When you start picking this stuff apart, again, it's just obfuscation. It's going to eventually settle down to something. And what it was a cryptocurrency clipboard stealer. So in the beginning, they were, as I said earlier, they were really targeting crypto libraries. So this one, I think, was Y-Finance and Solana and CCXT and those types of things. But in the end, it was just something that was hijacking your clipboard. And every time you wanted to put your crypto wallet in there, it would just dutifully insert its own. So, and this was about 900 packages over the course of a few days that went up. And this is where one of the places where we really got very involved with the PyPI research security team, because we were sending them a lot of stuff, and they have finite resources as well. And so working with them to say, okay, how do we continue to report this to you so that you can take it down, investigate it for yourself, take it down. In the meantime, the attackers are still, sending new stuff down the pike. So yeah, this was a pretty pernicious one, and I don't think this technique isn't going away anytime soon. Being able to detect when something is typo squatted is pretty easy. You can just simply, here's two strings, and their edit distance is 1 or 2, depending on how you're measuring edit distance. One of them is the real one of them is a malicious one. Like I said earlier, I think combo squatting is the actual much more difficult problem, where you jam popular words together. We saw a dry run of an attack. I guess it wasn't a dry run, but what they were delivering wasn't that bad. But first they started with a list of words, and they weren't really programmer. Some of them were programmer like words like lib or exec or pi or something, but some of them were just dumb. And they would just jam 2 words together. Then they would jam 3 words together. And they would jam 4 words together, and just this whole long list.
I know a lot of companies that create their company names by doing that, but yeah, I guess package maintainers are doing it too, right?
Yeah, and so that as that attack evolved, somebody else, well, presumably somebody else, maybe it was the same attackers that learned, realized that if you use a slightly more legitimate list, scikit-learn, beautiful soup, lib, dev, words that probably are going to kind of pass an easy eyeball test, be like, oh yeah, that's probably the right package.
Yeah.
They figured out that they could probably be a lot more successful than some of the other ones they were choosing.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, you just think about, doing a bag of words technique from a website, right? And you can just kind of mix and match those. And
Yep.
then, I I guess I have kind of an internal compass for just because I've used like Debian flavored Linux distros for so long that I kind of know a lot of what the package naming schemas are in that distro, or I should say in those Debian flavored distros like Ubuntu. But now you have to have an internal representation of like what resource you're talking to, because like Debian has a package registry, Fedora, but also Python, npm, et cetera, et cetera. So like if I want to install a package from Python using PyPI, I have to think of a certain naming scheme, and sometimes that package is also in like Debian and Fedora, but it doesn't necessarily have to subscribe to the same naming scheme. So like this is not just remembering the right thing; it's also knowing the set of things in the resource ahead of time, right? So that's a huge challenge, right?
For sure.
I can imagine how tough that is. Can you tell us a little bit more about like what people should be thinking about here?
Right. I mean, if you type pip install matplotlib, or you don't know that the Python package that is the legitimate one for the OpenSSL library is OpenSSL-Python, and you type pip install Python-OpenSSL, and you come to find out that somebody's got something malicious at that name. Like what is between you and the enter key? Like, what do you have? Do you have any boundaries or barriers between you and hitting return in the command line and not just getting whatever you get? Is there something in the way, something that can help you say, whoa, hang on. This looks really shady. There's something going on here that maybe, dear developer, you didn't really want. And let's pause for a second. That's what our command line tool. That's what Birdcage is all about, right? Is to be a sandboxed area to install packages where you can have a little bit of a safety mechanism. Because I mean, it's just like you were saying, it's implausible. Nobody's going to really review manually every line of source code for every package. Not just that, but for every dependency of every dependency, ... of every pack. Like it's intractable. And plus the fact developers have other things to do. So at least with Birdcage, like, okay, we looked at some things, and here's some artifacts that might be of interest to you. Let the buyer beware, You, dear developer, just so you know, here's some stuff that's going on.
Awesome. This has all been like super cool. I really appreciate you going through all this data. Tell us a little bit about your background and kind of how you got into, doing this kind of work. I think that'd be pretty interesting.
Yeah. So originally, I have a math degree, and so math is always my first love. But around 2010, I got involved in, well, at the time it was just cyber, all the things. And basically it was trying to find bad guys in traffic, network traffic. So in that arena, the packet, here's what really went across the wire, is your ground truth. Making heads or tails of that, stitching together a narrative, trying to find, suspiciousness, maliciousness, nefariousness. That's where I kind of spent quite a bit of my time before joining Phylum. And now with joining Phylum and learning about all the things that are involved in this, on the one hand, it seems very straightforward and simple because you just get a GitHub account and you clone a repo and you're off to the races. But there's a lot of things that are happening from a software engineering and ecosystem maintenance level that attackers are using and exploiting for their own benefit. But again, here's the package that was delivered to you, dear developer. And that's another kind of ground truth, right? And so we're looking for these sometimes strong indicators, but more often than not weak indicators, things that most of the time seem innocuous, but bad guys also do. And so labeling all of these packages with these tags, with these little artifacts, with these little features, and then pulling all those features together to say, okay, no one of these things is a smoking gun. There is no evil bit, that's flipped and says this package is bad. Yeah, it would be nice. But really sort of a body of circumstantial evidence in absence of, that is malicious code. That is, a remote access tool on your machine right there. Right. That's the experience that I'm bringing to this. It's fascinating. And, when you review all these packages, when we're reviewing our automated results to make sure that the false positives and the hit rates are correct, man, there's some weird stuff out there. There's a lot of weird code and some head scratchers where, we just I have no idea what this developer is even attempting to do. It's not often, but we sometimes find malware that doesn't even run. It just, it's poorly put together and
but even then, he was trying that stuff, right?
Yeah, but somebody else said, if something's dumb and it works, it's not dumb. And I think that's what a lot of these attackers are being successful with. And because they're automating and spraying so much of this stuff out, it really is the, spammer's value proposition. I sent out 10 million pieces of spam and I got 10 clicks and it was worth it because that all I needed was just a small number, even though most people, this isn't going to see the light of day to them. There's going to be somebody. And really, if you think about it in these open source ecosystems, and I think this is a point that needs to be really made well, the most vulnerable in this community are going to be people who are learning, people who are just learning the code, especially with all of these code camps out there. And, people know enough to be dangerous,
very good
but
point.
They're just unsophisticated. And, they'll get nicked by one of these attacks.
Interesting. So what should we look for in Q2? What do you think we're going to be seeing as we go forward in the year?
So for now, it looks like PyPI and NPM have stemmed the spam tide. We've seen a dramatic decrease in those packages. Some of them still leak through, and we're trying to investigate. How are these attackers still able to get some? But certainly the volumes have gone way down. Very intrigued by PyPI's action to halt new accounts. We have a brief write-up about that one too. And like I said, it's going to be a tough one to say, okay, what's the right thing to do here? Because I think if you do make it too onerous for people to register new accounts, that kind of flies in the face of the spirit of the open source ecosystem. Obfuscation, I think, is just going to get larger. I know there are a lot of packages that we see in NPM that are obfuscated, and it's just because somebody put an obfuscator in their package.json file. It isn't that they're not really doing anything malicious, but if you're obfuscating your code and you're releasing it in open source, you're kind of violating
what you're missing the point,
is supposed to point. Right. It's like you can't just say, well, I ticked the box and said I opened, you have my source code. Yeah, but I can't reason about it. That's the whole point of obfuscation. I can't, if you and I are collaborating on an open source project, I write the code in such a way that I want to communicate to you, another human mind, here are my ideas, and then you and I can exchange those ideas. And that's sort of the good version of the open source ecosystem.
Yeah,
And
the
yet,
ethos of it, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. As soon as you start obfuscating anything, I think it's well within our rights to go, nope, sorry, you're doing something wrong. And most importantly, the developer who's installing that code ought to be aware.
Yeah.
Again, because you're not going to look over every line of code, but at least like somebody took effort to willfully hide what they're doing from you in their source code.
Yeah. And at some level, if you're, if it kind of quacks like a duck, if it behaves like things malicious software does, at the very least, we should be aware that it's kind of having these behaviors, right? Like,
That's right.
That's spot on.
That's right. And I think the last one is just more automation. Like we're going to see as, as one technique or tactic is thwarted, they'll just try something else. But, in this economy of these malicious attackers, right? They want to be able to make their profit while they sleep, right? They just hit their button and it's running all night long, and maybe they get a, hey, your attack has failed or something like that. And then they just turn it on again and try something else. So I think we're going to see a lot more creative automation.
Yeah, and kind of thinking about this, like, what does it cost for mounting one of these attacks? It seems like it's zero. There's nothing, right? And that was one of the things that, I look back on how Microsoft Windows really, really leveled up. If you rip out all the legacy stuff, new Windows code is actually quite good. Aside from the legacy support, kind of backward compatibility. But one of the things they did really effectively was make it so it was much, much more expensive to exploit software. And that reduced the set of people to a much, much smaller set. And as such, we don't see nearly as many comparatively. There's still a ton, of course, because there's a lot of focus. It's a big market. But thinking about the open source ecosystems, like if it's not, if it's costless to mount these attacks, like it's not, we got to move that needle somewhere, right? We got to improve that.
Yeah. So shortly after PyPI's pause this weekend on new accounts, they came out with another thing that really hit Hacker News. They answered a subpoena or a set of subpoenas that they were given by the DOJ. And that also got me thinking, like, we think about what we can do in code. We think about what we can do for the developer at the machine. But to your point, if there is a jurisdictional authority and there is an actual victim, that's normal law enforcement work.
Right.
And the question is going to be, okay, but where? Like, as you pointed out earlier, in some places, there's no law enforcement entity that's going to stop certain actors from doing certain things. But some places there are. And I think these attackers should heed, it's when you're trying to steal stuff from people.
You better be careful.
You better be careful. Yeah. And, but as long as there are very low to no consequences, they're just going to keep on keeping on.
Yeah. Ross, thanks so much for joining us and for giving us all this insight on the work you've been doing. Please come back to the channel. We'll have some more content here pretty soon. And thanks so much for your time.